This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. On Wednesday's Top 10, I looked at the worst mechanics in the game. I used statistics about how much those cards were played at the highest level in Magic to make the list, and this video is the flip side of that. I'm using the same methodology to talk about the 10 mechanics that have been the most dominant in Magic's history. In case you didn't see Wednesday's video, here's how I came up with this list. First, I used my usual ranking system for each card and each mechanic, that is, 2 points for Pro Tour and Mythic Championship and Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s, and 1 point for Grand Prix top 8s. Then for each mechanic, I looked at how many cards were printed for that mechanic, what percentage of the cards with each mechanic managed 1 point or more, and then I took a collective score from all the cards in each mechanic and divided it by the number of cards with that mechanic to come up with a points per card statistic. Every mechanic that appears on this list happens to have 50% or more of the cards printed with it gain 1 point or better, so I think when we're looking at points per card for mechanics that had that many cards played, we're going to see the mechanics that were the most dominant collectively, and not only reward the mechanics like flying, which have had a lot of cards see play over the years, but when you really look at all the different cards with flying that are out there that exist, you see that it's not as dominant as any of the mechanics that we're going to be talking about on this list, because there's just so many cards with flying that aren't that good. Before we get to number 10, I do have an honorable mention I want to talk about that I think most people will think makes this list, and I myself thought it would too. And that mechanic is Affinity. It is often cited as one of the most busted mechanics around, and while I'm not arguing that it isn't, I do think how good the mechanic itself is has gotten overblown over the years. So yes, there was a deck called Affinity that dominated Standard and Extended when Mirrodin Block was the latest set out, but it is worth noting that most of the cards in the deck don't have Affinity. The same is true of modern Affinity decks today. There are some lists that have 0 cards with the actual mechanic. Back in the day, Affinity decks did run Thoughtcast, Frogmite, and Mirror Enforcer, but those have long fallen by the wayside. The key cards in Affinity, in the long run, have been Arcbound Ravager and Cranial Plating, neither of which has Affinity. Basically, an artifact-heavy deck was certainly made busted by Mirrodin Block, especially the inclusion of artifact lands, but Affinity itself didn't play as prominent a role in the so-called Affinity deck, or subsequent versions of that deck as you would think. Of the 22 cards with Affinity, only 6 have seen play, a much lower rate than anything else on this list, with Thoughtcast really being the only one consistently used for the last decade or so. Alright, with that out of the way, let's move to number 10. At number 10, we have the only evergreen keyword ability to make the list. An evergreen keyword is one that Wizards includes in every set, like Flying or First Strike, and Hexproof has been one of those since 2012, appearing in every single set since then. Hexproof is in many ways a more powerful version of the retired Shroud mechanic, which didn't let either player target a permanent, but Hexproof lets the creature's controller target it. Hexproof is a frustrating mechanic to play against in just about any format, because suddenly your spot removal, which most decks run a fair bit of, is completely useless. This fact alone probably wouldn't have been enough to make Hexproof one of the most busted abilities of all time. That problem is created by the fact that these types of creatures are great for auras. Normally, auras are incredibly dangerous to play because of the 2-for-1 that can result from them. In other words, players can kill your creature with an aura with 1 removal spell, and you're behind 2 cards. Hexproof doesn't care about that, and a creature getting increasingly larger while they have even more and more auras slapped on them has been a successful strategy in more than one format. Even without auras, there are some insanely powerful creatures who have hexproof and can kill you in a hurry if you don't do something about them, like Geist of St. Traft. And really, all you can do about a hexproof creature is kill it in combat or with a board sweeper. Wizards is much more careful these days about how they print hexproof. It is often situational, like on Dragonlord Ojutai, or on creatures that are so expensive that they'll never be good targets for decks interested in playing auras like Wardscale Crocodile. Still, hexproof is an incredibly powerful keyword ability, and maybe even the best evergreen keyword ability, since it's the only one to make the list. At number 9, we have a mechanic that caused a lot of panic when it was first revealed during Alara Reborn spoiler season, and that's Cascade. Frequently, the community overreacts when new mechanics are revealed, as lots of mechanics look more busted on paper than they are in practice. However, with Cascade, the community was right. And how could they be wrong? Cascade lets you cast a spell for free from your deck, usually guaranteeing that you're going to get a 2-for-1 whatever card with Cascade that you play. It is pretty difficult not to get your mana's worth out of cards like Bloodbraid Elf and Shardless Agent. Sure, they are a bit overcosted for their stats, but even hitting a 1-mana spell with them has you coming out way ahead. So, in a vacuum, Cascade is already incredibly strong enough that Bloodbraid Elf spent a long time on the banned and restricted list. But once people figured out you could really abuse Cascade, in particular with the rare cycle of mana costless cards with Suspend from Time Spiral, that pushed Cascade into truly busted territory. Less powerful cards with Cascade, even outright bad ones, like Violent Outburst, suddenly started seeing play because they could cascade into Living End or Hypergenesis, ending the game in a hurry, provided you made sure your deck had nothing with a mana cost lower than your Cascade spells, apart from your Living End or Hypergenesis. Anytime you played something with Cascade, you got to cast one of them from your deck, and that was amazing. So yeah, between just being a really powerful mechanic all on its own, especially on creatures, the Cascade mechanic also had the unforeseen circumstance, as Wizards has admitted, of being an insane combo with that cycle from Time Spiral block. At number 8, I have Devotion. Most of the mechanics on this list have seen play across multiple formats and been busted there, but there are two that were only truly busted within their own standard format, and Devotion is one of those. Devotion is seemingly innocuous. It looks at the number of mana symbols of a particular color that you have, and you get an effect of some kind equal to that number. Seems like an interesting way to push monocolored decks, something that hadn't really been a thing in any sort of consistent way in several years by the time Theros came out. However, they pushed a little bit too hard here, and Devotion came to completely dominate Standard, making it incredibly uninteresting. There were just way too many cards with Devotion that had high power levels, as indicated by the fact that over half of the cards printed with the mechanic found their way into Standard top 8s. A Standard that in terms of the color of the decks had lots of diversity, but they were pretty much all Devotion decks, because why would you ever stray from cards like Master of Waves or Grey Merchant of Asphodel? Luckily, Devotion has never established a foothold anywhere else, and I would imagine that next time we go to Theros, trust me, it's coming, we will either see a new mechanic or cards that are significantly less powerful with it, since there's no way Wizards wants to create such a homogeneous standard again. At number 7, I have Flashback. Of all the mechanics to make this list, this was the most surprising to me. Pretty much every other mechanic on the list is one that has been mentioned at one point or another in the community as among the most busted or frustrating, but Flashback usually isn't part of those conversations. People certainly consider it to be a good mechanic, but it isn't in conversations about the most powerful mechanics ever, but maybe it should be, because it turns out that slapping Flashback on a card is a pretty good way to power it up and make sure it sees some play, since more than half of the 111 cards printed with the mechanic over the years have managed 1 point or more. Flashback is powerful because it almost always generates you some card advantage, and it gives you something to do with your mana in the late game, when you otherwise may not be able to do anything if you flood out. It is further bolstered by the fact that it synergizes incredibly well with decks that like to mill themselves, because when those decks mill a card with Flashback, they effectively add a card to their hand. And yes, that card is usually a bit overcosted, like on Call of the Herd here, but you are still generating card advantage, and over the course of the game, that's a good way to win. Then, there are cards with Flashback that are absurdly efficient, with Lingering Souls probably being the greatest example of that. So yeah, Flashback is incredibly powerful every time we see it, and if we ever see it again, I think it'll continue to have an impressive record. At number 6, we have Energy, which, like Devotion, came to completely dominate a standard format and make it completely uninteresting. While kind of a cool idea, it gives players another type of resource to keep track of, which can be used for a whole bunch of different purposes. This mechanic was pushed way too hard, and Standard largely amounted to just taking the best cards that produce or use energy and cramming them into a deck together. Energy decks had access to everything. Mana fixing from Servant of the Conduit, Attune with Ether, and Ether Hub meant you could play 4 colors with no problem, and in turn made it possible to cram every good energy card into a deck. This included powerful removal spells like Harness Lightning, efficient creatures like Bristling Hydra and Longtusk Cub, and then also insane combo pieces like Aetherworks Marvel. Eventually, energy decks became so dominant in Standard that several cards that powered these decks, including Attune with Ether, Rogue Refiner, and Aetherworks Marvel, had to get banned out of the format to put an end to the dominant reign of energy, and Standard actually became interesting again. Because energy is a parasitic mechanic, in other words, all the cards that do stuff with it are only in a couple of sets, energy will probably never take off in other formats just because there aren't enough cards, unless Wizards makes the big mistake of bringing it back at some point, but let's hope they don't. At number 5, I have Miracle. The mechanic to make the list with the fewest cards, as only 12 have been printed with this one, but as you'll see, we're probably happy about that. The Miracle mechanic was another one that came from a cool idea, but was pushed a little bit too hard. If a card has Miracle, you can reveal it when you draw the first card in a turn and cast it for its Miracle cost. This could have been designed in a way that maybe it wouldn't be overpowered, and there are a few cards with it that definitely fall into that category. But then there are cards like Temporal Mastery, which becomes Time Walk when you cast it for its Miracle cost, Terminus, which is a 1-mana Wrath effect, and Bonfire of the Damned, which is an incredibly powerful one-sided board sweeper that also damages the opponent, because why not? This is already pretty powerful, but because of the way the mechanic is worded, you can also use these cards on your opponent's turn, provided you find a way to draw a card during your opponent's turn, and yes, that includes sorceries like Bonfire or Terminus. Like Cascade, Miracle is inherently powerful in a vacuum. It didn't really need extra help when cards this powerful were already printed. But in Eternal formats, Miracle could be even more effectively abused. Access to Sensei's Divining Top, Brainstorm, and other cards that manipulate the top of the library make it much less of a game of chance when it comes to trying to draw a card with Miracle and more of a certainty. In 2011, the top got banned out of Legacy because Miracle decks were so dominant. Still, Miracle decks do survive to this day, they just aren't as consistent as they once were, but the mechanic is still powerful enough to pull its weight. At number 4, we have Dredge. The top 4 in this list probably aren't going to surprise anyone, and honestly, I think you could shuffle around the top 4 on this list in any order, and you'd be able to make a good argument for that mechanic being the most busted ever, but using my methodology, Dredge is at number 4. Dredge has the highest play percentage of any mechanic on this list, with 84.6% of the cards printed with it getting 1 point or more. There are only 13 cards printed with Dredge, but almost all of them have at least 1 point. Dredge originally debuted as the Golgari mechanic in our first trip to Ravnica, and proved to be far more powerful than anyone in R&D had imagined. Cards with Dredge let you get them out of your graveyard in exchange for milling cards from the top of your library. The idea for Wizards seems to just have been that it gave you some card selection, and maybe you'd have some nice graveyard synergy, and that was mostly true in Standard. But in every other format in Magic, it's utterly busted. Dredge lets you load up your graveyard in a hurry, and the first decks to really abuse it were in Extended, and sought to mill their whole library and play creatures like Icarid from the graveyard. Since then, things have gotten even sillier, as there are decks in Eternal formats that run no mana, and just plan on dredging themselves into oblivion, and then getting a win condition in play from their graveyard with no problem. So yeah, Dredge has been a dominant deck in all of Magic's formats that aren't Standard, and various bannings over the year have tried to nerf it, with Golgari Grave Troll the biggest example, but it continues to be an excellent deck. Loading up your graveyard in a hurry with everything you need to win the game is just too easy with Dredge. It frequently doesn't matter what a card with Dredge actually does, apart from the whole having Dredge thing, and that's why so many cards with Dredge have seen play. I think that means that overall, this mechanic is not only incredibly overpowered, but an utter design failure. This is a mechanic that I don't think we'll ever see again. At number 3, we have Storm, a mechanic so busted that Mark Rosewater's Storm Scale, the scale he created for guessing whether or not mechanics will return, is named for the mechanic, with a 10 on the scale, meaning this will never happen again because this mechanic is utterly busted, so we're never going to print it ever again. Worth noting that all of the top 4 on this list are 10s on the Storm Scale, by the way. Anyway, yeah, Storm is stupid. Much like Dredge, Wizards underrated just how great the mechanic was. Storm is behind only Dredge in terms of the percentage of cards with the mechanic that have been played, with an impressive 68.4%. So, when you cast a card with Storm, you get to create a copy of that spell for each other spell you cast that turn. Clearly, in playtesting, Wizards really only thought about Standard, thinking, well, how are you really going to get a high storm count here? And they were sort of right. There was a Standard deck called Mind's Desire that could get an insane amount of storm by producing a bunch of mana, untapping lands, producing more mana. But for the most part in Standard, it wasn't completely busted. But like with Dredge, they didn't take a careful look at other formats. Other formats are loaded up with ways to cantrip, add tons of mana to your mana pool, untap all your lands, and so forth, and you can just chain these all together until you reach a storm count that just means game over for your opponent. One of the most frustrating things about Storm 2 is that counter magic against it is pretty useless. You have to find a way to put an end to your opponent's chain of spells before they get to the point that Storm kills you, because even if you counter the card that has Storm, you're only countering a single copy of it, and you're also adding another spell to the stack if you do it too early, because Storm doesn't just count your opponent's spells. So beating Storm is not an easy thing to do for most decks. It can almost completely goldfish and just kill an opponent with Tendrils of Agony or Brain Freeze on the spot. Storm decks have gone on to be relevant in every format at some point or another, and continue to be until this day because, well, this mechanic is completely busted. We'll never see Storm again, and we should be thankful for that. At number 2, I have Rexian Mana. I don't really know what to say about this one. Mechanics like Dredge and Storm are, I think, understandable mistakes, as those effects were fairly unique, and when they made those mistakes, they kind of learned their lesson. Rexian Mana, not so much. Cards printed that can have alternate casting costs have always been strong, and they printed way too many cards with Rexian Mana that cost effectively 0 mana and 2 life. So, With Rexian Mana, you can pay mana of a specific color or 2 life for each Rexian Mana symbol. This not only creates free spells like Gitaxian Probe, which, by the way, synergizes really well with Storm, but it also, sort of like Energy and Devotion, makes it so decks aren't going to be all that diverse. You don't need to be playing a specific color to shove a powerful removal spell like Dismember into your deck. Everybody can play it, no problem. And that's just a bad idea. Standard was dominated by cards that used Phyrexian Mana as a result, and many Phyrexian cards have gone on to be powerhouses in non-rotating formats, especially the free ones. Gitaxian Probe, a card that Wizards clearly initially thought was completely innocuous, eventually had to be banned in Modern and restricted in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage, a good indicator of the massive impact on the game these cards had. If Wizards ever plans on bringing this back, they're going to have to be careful about what they put it on and how they cost the cards. And at number 1 is a mechanic not that dissimilar from Phyrexian Mana, so they really didn't learn their lesson, and that's Delve, another mechanic that makes it way too easy to drastically reduce the cost of spells. It is also a mechanic that pairs well with fellow busted mechanic Dredge, since the mechanic lets you reduce the cost of spells by exiling cards from your graveyard. While this time around they didn't make the mistake of printing anything that cost 0 mana, they did make the mistake of printing cards that could cost as little as 1 mana, and it was way too easy to get there in Eternal formats. Treasure Cruise essentially became Ancestral Recall in Vintage and Legacy, and even in Modern it was absurdly powerful. These all resulted in bannings and restrictions across multiple formats. Dig Through Time was also another big offender that got hit with the ban hammer. In addition to these powerful card draw spells, decks that could load their graveyards effectively could play creatures like Tasigur or Gurmag Angler as early as turn 1 or 2. In the end, Delve proved to be way too powerful, since it lets you cast things worth a lot more than 1 mana way too easily. So, there it is. Those are the 10 mechanics that I think are the most busted in the history of the game. Are there any mechanics you think I left out, or are there any you think that I'm overrating? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, which drop every Wednesday and Friday, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see past MTG Top 10s, including the one I did last Wednesday on the worst mechanics in the game, you can see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.